Have you ever found yourself in a place so profoundly isolated, so far removed from the familiar hum of civilization, that the silence itself begins to take on a physical presence? A silence so deep it feels like it's pressing in on you, listening, waiting. A place where every creak of the old house, every rustle in the dense woods outside, sounds amplified, distorted, and utterly wrong. This is the kind of story that makes you check your locks twice before going to bed. So, before the story truly begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening, drop your city and local time in the comments, and if you've had a similar creepy encounter, share it below. Maybe your story will inspire the next one. Now, dim the lights. Feel the air grow colder and try to ignore the shadows dancing at the corner of your eye. Let's dive together into tonight's nightmare. For years, Sarah and I had harbored this shared fantasy. To escape the concrete jungle, the endless meetings, the incessant noise, and carve out a piece of tranquility for ourselves. We dreamt of mornings filled with birdsong, evenings under a canopy of stars untouched by light pollution, and the simple rhythm of a life lived closer to nature. That dream finally materialized in the form of an old, neglected remote cabin nestled deep within the Cascade Mountains. It was everything we'd pictured and more. A rustic log structure, 2 stories, sprawling front porch, and seemingly endless acres of untouched forest as our backyard. The nearest town, a tiny speck on the map called Blackwood, was a good 45-minute drive down a winding, unpaved road. Cell service was non-existent. It was perfect. We closed the deal in late spring, planning to spend the summer months renovating and settling in, embracing the solitude. The initial weeks were idyllic. We spent our days sanding down old floorboards, painting walls, and clearing overgrown paths. The air was crisp, scented with pine and damp earth. Evenings were spent by the crackling wood stove, reading or simply watching the dance of the flames while the darkness outside swallowed the world whole. Sarah, ever the meticulous planner, had organized everything, including our weekly trips to Blackwood for groceries and supplies. Our closest neighbor lived more than 5 miles away, a fact we initially reveled in. It was absolute freedom. Our grounding detail, the way we knew where we were in the world, was a massive, ancient ponderosa pine just beyond our property line. Its top snapped clean off by what must have been an epic lightning strike decades ago. It stood like a silent sentinel, visible from our kitchen window. The first hint that our paradise might be less than perfect came subtly, easily dismissed. A door left ajar that I swore I'd closed, a tool missing from where I'd put it, only to reappear later in plain sight. Sarah laughed it off, blaming cabin brain, our affectionate term for the mild disorientation that comes with a complete change of environment. My initial thought was that perhaps the old building was just settling, creaking and groaning as old houses do. Maybe the wind played tricks, forcing a window latch to give. I was an urban creature after all, unaccustomed to the nuances of such a desolate place. This was my element of ambiguity, dismissing every anomaly as the product of a tired mind or an unfamiliar setting. Then came the sounds, rustling in the undergrowth outside, initially attributed to deer or raccoons. The woods were teeming with wildlife after all, but after a few weeks, the rustling seemed to become deliberate, like something heavy moving slowly, methodically, just beyond the tree line after dusk. One evening, as Sarah and I were having dinner, a distinct scratching started on the porch. We both froze, looking at each other. "Bear," Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively going to my arm. I thought about the bear spray we kept by the door, but the sound didn't feel heavy enough for a bear. It was a lighter, more persistent scrape, almost rhythmic. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door, shining the beam into the encroaching darkness. Nothing. Only the quiet, dense forest stretching out before us. I remember thinking how strange it was that the air immediately felt colder just beyond the threshold. This was my foreshadowing detail, that chilling drop in temperature right at the edge of our perceived safety. The incidents began to escalate, subtly at first, then with increasing clarity. I'd be working in the garage, only to hear what sounded like footsteps directly above me in the attic. When I climbed the rickety ladder to investigate, the small, dusty space would be empty, undisturbed. Sarah started complaining about waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping gently against her bedroom window. We'd always slept with the windows open, enjoying the cool mountain air, but after a week of this, she insisted on keeping them shut. "It's just branches," I'd reassure her, though I knew the nearest branch was several feet from the house. There was an old, gnarled oak that reached towards the house, but its limbs didn't quite touch. One afternoon, I was splitting firewood by the side of the house. It was a clear, sunny day, the kind that made you feel invigorated. I remember the rhythmic thud of the axe, the smell of fresh-cut pine. Suddenly, I felt a profound sense of being watched. Not like an animal observing from afar, but a focused, intense gaze, almost palpable against the back of my neck. I stopped, axe mid-swing, and slowly turned. The forest was silent, motionless. No birds, no squirrels scampering, just the dense green wall of trees and the faint glint of sunlight through the leaves. Nothing was there, but the feeling persisted, strong and unsettling. I distinctly felt as though I was being observed from within the darkest shadows under the pines. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of an intruder. The hairs on my arms were standing on end. I chalked it up to nerves, the isolation getting to me, but a cold dread had begun to settle deep in my stomach. A few days later, we returned from our weekly supply run to Blackwood. As we drove up the long dirt road to our remote cabin, a strange sight caught my eye. The heavy wooden gate at the entrance to our property, which I had padlocked before we left, was wide open. The padlock itself was lying on the ground, not broken, but unlocked and unlatched. My heart immediately began to pound. We kept that gate locked for a reason: privacy, security. "Did you unlock it?" I asked Sarah, my voice tight. She shook her head, her face pale. "No, I'm sure I didn't. You always do the locks." We both knew this was true. I was always meticulous with security. We drove slowly up to the cabin, scanning the perimeter. Everything seemed normal, but the unease was now a tangible thing, heavy in the air. We checked every window, every door. Nothing was disturbed inside, no obvious signs of forced entry. Yet the unlocked gate felt like a violation. It was a deliberate act, not an accident. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak, every distant hoot of an owl sent a shiver down my spine. We knew then, with grim certainty, that we were not alone out here. Something else clearly lived here, and it was beginning to make its presence known. The incident with the gate was a turning point. It stripped away our comforting illusions of peace and replaced them with a gnawing uncertainty. What was once a dream home had begun to feel like a very exposed, very vulnerable cage. We started taking precautions, reinforcing locks, installing motion-sensing lights around the perimeter. We even bought a couple of trail cameras, hoping to catch whatever was tampering with our property. The cameras, however, proved useless. They'd detect motion, all right, deer, squirrels, the occasional fox, but never anything related to the strange occurrences. It was as if whatever was watching us knew precisely how to avoid detection. This element of ambiguity was maddening. The lack of concrete evidence made us question our sanity almost as much as it fueled our fear. Were we just overly paranoid adults, letting the profound isolation get to us? One evening, I was cleaning out the old shed, a task I'd been putting off. It was a dusty, spider-web-filled space attached to the back of the garage. As I sorted through rusted tools and forgotten gardening supplies, I stumbled upon a small, crudely carved wooden figurine tucked away behind a stack of old paint cans. It was unsettling, a rough humanoid shape, perhaps 6 inches tall, with exaggerated wide eyes and no discernible mouth. It looked ancient, almost primitive, and carried a strange, heavy energy. My grounding detail, something I'd never forget, was the distinct, oily smell of pine tar that clung to it. It wasn't a smell you'd forget. I showed it to Sarah, who recoiled. "Burn it," she said, her voice laced with an unfamiliar urgency. "It feels wrong." I felt it too, but curiosity, or perhaps a foolish sense of defiance, made me hesitate. Instead, I wrapped it in an old cloth and put it in a shoebox on a high shelf in the garage, intending to dispose of it properly later. I never did. The silence of the woods, once a comfort, transformed into a malevolent presence. It felt like a held breath, perpetually waiting. The rustling sounds outside the remote cabin in the dead of night intensified. They weren't animalistic anymore. They sounded heavy, like something dragging itself through the undergrowth circling the house. We'd lie awake, clinging to each other, listening to the methodical, crunching steps just beyond our windows. One night, the distinct sound of someone or something pacing on our front porch became undeniably clear. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I crept to the window, heart hammering against my ribs, and peered through a sliver in the curtains. The motion lights, which should have been triggered by anything on the porch, remained stubbornly off. The porch was bathed in moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows. There was nothing there, but the sounds continued. I swore I could hear the faint creak of the porch swing, as if something was slowly settling into it. A cold wave of terror washed over me, a realization that whatever this was, it wasn't just physical. It was something else, something unseen. Our sleep became a luxury we could no longer afford. Sarah began seeing things in her peripheral vision, fleeting shadows darting past windows, indistinct shapes moving at the very edge of the tree line. She'd wake me up, breathless, convinced she'd seen someone watching her from the darkness. I tried to rationalize it, blame the stress, the isolation, but deep down I knew better. The fear was becoming real, concrete. It was no longer a question of if something was out there, but what it was and what it wanted. My foreshadowing detail was etched into my memory, the way the air would turn frigid almost instantly every time one of these events occurred, a bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with the weather. One particularly dark and stormy night, the power went out. The cabin was plunged into absolute blackness, save for the flickering light of our battery-powered lanterns. The wind howled like a tortured beast, rattling the old windows. Rain lashed against the roof. It was the perfect backdrop for horror. Sarah and I huddled together by the fireplace, trying to keep warm, trying to convince ourselves it was just a typical mountain storm. Then we heard it from upstairs. A faint, rhythmic scratching coming from our bedroom. We both looked up, faces pale in the lantern light. It wasn't tapping like before. It was a slow, deliberate scrape, then another scrape against the floorboards. It sounded like something heavy being dragged. I grabbed the old hunting rifle I kept tucked away, more for show than anything, and slowly ascended the stairs, Sarah clutching my shirt from behind. Every creak of the old wooden steps sounded like a thunderclap. As I reached the landing, the scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, punctuated only by the storm's fury outside. I pushed open our bedroom door, rifle raised. The room was dark, save for the weak glow of my lantern. Nothing seemed out of place. No broken window, no overturned furniture. But then, as I scanned the room, my light fell upon something on the floor, right in the center of the room. A meticulous spiraling pattern had been carved into the wooden floorboards. It wasn't deep, more like an etching, but it was undeniable. And next to it, partially visible under the edge of the bed, was the small, crudely carved wooden figurine I'd found in the shed. The one I'd put in a shoebox on a high shelf in the garage. My hands started to tremble uncontrollably. This wasn't some animal or a prankster. This was something that could move through locked doors, something that knew about the figurine, something that was sending us a terrifying message. We didn't sleep at all that night. We sat downstairs by the fireplace, the rifle across my lap, staring into the flickering flames, occasionally glancing nervously at the dark staircase. The carved symbol on our bedroom floor felt like a violation of our most sacred space. It was a declaration. We were no longer just being watched, we were being actively terrorized. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, almost innocent-looking landscape. But the innocence was gone for us. We packed bags, throwing essentials in without much thought. We had to leave. We had to. The fear had reached a crescendo, a suffocating presence that clung to every shadow, every quiet corner of our remote cabin. As we prepared to drive away, I took one last look at our bedroom window. And there it was, etched clearly into the condensation on the glass, the same spiraling symbol from the floor. It was a perfect, chilling replica, as if drawn with a precise, deliberate finger. I didn't say anything to Sarah. I just got in the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as the dirt road would allow, leaving our dream and our terror behind. But leaving, we soon realized, was not the same as escaping. Leaving the remote cabin should have brought a sense of relief, a release from the suffocating dread that had become our constant companion. For a while, it did. The familiar sight of asphalt roads, the distant hum of traffic as we drove back towards civilization, felt like a balm to our frayed nerves. We found a small motel a few hours away, planning to stay there until we figured out our next steps. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful, haunted by images of the carved symbol and the phantom sounds of pacing on our porch. We tried to convince ourselves that distance meant safety, that the entity, whatever it was tethered to that desolate stretch of mountains, to that cabin. We were wrong. The subtle signs began almost immediately. A distinct chill that would inexplicably fill our small motel room, even with the heating on full blast. The faint, oily smell of pine tar, something I'd only ever associated with the wooden figurine, would occasionally waft through the air, then vanish just as quickly. Sarah started having vivid nightmares, waking up screaming about shadowy figures watching her from the foot of the bed. I tried to comfort her, but the truth was, I felt it too. The pervasive sense of being watched, the unsettling awareness of something just beyond the periphery of our vision, remained stubbornly with us. It was an element of ambiguity that twisted our minds. Was it truly following us, or had the trauma simply broken our perception of reality? One morning, I found a small, perfectly formed spiral etched into the condensation on the bathroom mirror. My breath caught in my throat. It was identical to the one on our bedroom floor, the one on our cabin window. My grounding detail, the way I knew this wasn't just my imagination, was the distinct, oily residue it left on my finger when I touched it, the same residue as the pine tar figurine. I didn't show it to Sarah. I just wiped it away, feigning calmness, but a cold dread had begun to solidify in my gut. This wasn't just in the cabin, it was with us. We moved motel rooms, then to another town entirely, hoping to outrun it. It was futile. The occurrences grew bolder, more personal. Objects would move in plain sight. My car keys, left on the nightstand, would suddenly be hanging from the lampshade. Sarah's hairbrush, placed on the dresser, would be found beneath the bed. There was no breaking and entering, no shattered window. It was as if whatever this thing was, it could simply be there, wherever we were, violating our personal space with impunity. One night, the tapping returned. Not on a window, but on the inside of our rented apartment's bedroom closet door. It was a soft, methodical tap, 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 coming from within the darkness. Sarah whimpered, burying her face into my chest. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon I had, and slowly, cautiously, approached the closet. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, but I couldn't leave Sarah to face whatever this was alone. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and flung open the closet door. The closet was empty, exactly as we had left it. No sign of anything, no hidden compartment, nothing. But the tapping continued, now emanating from the wall directly behind where the closet had been. It was inside the very structure of the building, laughing at our attempts to flee. My foreshadowing detail, the terrifying realization that our escape was an illusion, manifested in that moment. The faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to echo from within the walls, just beyond the reach of human hearing, repeating our names. This was no longer about a haunted remote cabin. This was about something that had latched onto us, something that had followed us, something that saw us as its new territory. The confrontational climax wasn't a violent battle, but a psychological siege. It didn't want to physically harm us, not directly. It wanted to break us, to drive us mad with fear and uncertainty. It wanted to inhabit our minds, to make our every waking moment a living nightmare. We sold everything we owned, including the cabin, at a significant loss, of course. We moved across the country, changed our names, cut ties with old friends, anything to create a fresh start, a void for this thing to, hopefully, not cross. It's been 5 years since we last set foot in the Cascade Mountains. 5 years since we saw that final spiral on our bedroom window. And for those 5 years, we've lived in a kind of quiet, constant terror. The events have lessened in frequency, but they haven't stopped entirely. A misplaced item, a sudden chill, the faint smell of pine tar on a random breeze, the undeniable sensation of being watched from the darkest corner of a room. These are its subtle reminders that it's still out there, still knows where we are, still keeping tabs. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear it, a faint, rhythmic thumpy-thump coming from somewhere just beyond the thin walls of our new, anonymous house. And sometimes, when I look closely at the condensation on our bathroom mirror after a hot shower, there's a faint, almost invisible swirl, gone as quickly as it appeared. It's a whisper on the edge of my sanity, a chilling reminder that our escape was never complete. We are forever looking over our shoulders, forever feeling the cold breath of something unseen. We bought a remote cabin, but something else clearly lives here, and it still does, with us. The silence now is different. It's no longer the vast, natural quiet of the mountains, but a strained, artificial hush. We live our lives in muted tones, always vigilant, always listening. Every distant siren, every creak of the floorboards sends a jolt of ice through our veins. We never truly unpacked all our boxes. A part of us always expects to move again, to flee into another anonymous town, another faceless house, but we know it's in vain. The remote cabin was just the gateway. The true haunting lies within us now. It's a permanent scar, a psychological burden woven into the very fabric of our existence. Sarah still sleeps with the lights on, and I find myself checking the locks multiple times a night, a ritual born of terror, a futile gesture against an unseen enemy. We've learned to live with the fear, to suppress the urge to scream when a shadow moves too quickly, when a door clicks shut with no breeze. But the peace we sought, the tranquility we craved, is gone forever. It's a constant, chilling reminder that some dreams, when pursued too eagerly, can open doors to nightmares you can never close. We exist in a perpetual state of unease, forever waiting for the next sign, the next subtle intrusion. It wants us to know it's still here, and it always will be.